is Jessica Gorham, and I'm the Regional Emergency GBV Advisor, working on behalf of the Regional or the GBV Area of Responsibility, or AOR, which is the global coordination mechanism for GBV in emergencies. And you probably also know my colleague and counterpart in Sudan, Akiko. Akiko, you want to say a quick hello?
Mute. Hi everyone, this is Akiko. I'm a GBV subsector coordinator for Sudan, and I'd like to thank Eva, our shelter cluster coordinator in Sudan for organizing this collaboration and organizing this very important session. I would also like to thank, of course, Jessica for leading this session. As she mentioned, she's a regional advisor. And there are many countries that are going through similar challenges and from in the region. So she's going to talk about risk mitigation for shelter programming, and bringing in the good practice from the region as well. To thank our headquarter GBV or headquarter Geneva colleague Shiva, so for organizing, setting up the platform and coordinating the registration. Further ado, I will hand it back to Jessica. Hope you enjoy the session. And by the end of the session, we hope that we can come up with concrete recommendation so that we can continue to follow up. To mitigate risk in shelters programming. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Akiko. So as mentioned, today we will be focusing on risk mitigation measures within the shelter cluster. And so we're really happy to see so many of you on the line today. If we could please make sure that our microphones are on mute throughout. And I'm going to turn on my camera just for a few minutes so that you can see me here. I am sitting with Akiko here in Nairobi. But if we could please keep our cameras off or our videos off so that everyone has the best opportunity as possible to join us, because it does take a lot of the bandwidth when we are all on video. So please do put your videos off. I see John Bosco, if you could as well, I would appreciate it. All videos off so that everyone has the same opportunity to join us in terms of bandwidth. That would be appreciated. Also, if you have any questions throughout our time together, please do feel free to write those questions in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat along with Akiko. So if it's a question that she can answer very simply, she will respond to you in the chat. Otherwise, I might ask you to unmute yourself. And then you can answer to the whole plenary group. So please, no videos, just because it's harder for some of us in more hard to reach areas where we don't have a strong connection to join us. And then also, if you have questions, please feel free to write them in the chat, and Akiko and myself are monitoring the chat, or there will be opportunities for you to unmute yourselves as we move forward. I'll also be calling on volunteers throughout my time presenting. So please do, if you want to volunteer, please, you can raise your hand and I will see that emoticon or the icon, the hand raising icon. Or if you unmute yourself, then you automatically come to the top of the participant list and I can call on you that way. So just a couple of rules. to make our time a little bit easier, I'm going to turn off my video so that I'm also following my own advice about no video. If also you might notice that I am speaking very slowly, so this is because I realize that we have some of us on the line where English is a second or third or sometimes even fourth language. So I am going to speak slower and hopefully articulate as well as I can. So for some of you, it might seem I'm going a bit too slow, but please remember we have lots of other people on the line who are translating in their head. So I'm going to speak slower and then articulate more so that hopefully they'll be able to understand me with my American accent. And I'm all volunteering just if to read slides or to answer questions. That's what I would be my expectation. Okay, I think Akiko, if we can start sharing our screen and we can get started. As I mentioned, today we're going to be focusing on mitigating GBV risks in shelter interventions. And as I said, I'm really happy to see so many of you on the line today joining us. Next slide, please. Hopefully, you have all been able to participate in our first series of webinars that we had just a few weeks ago. And that set of webinars was on the pocket guide. So really, there are two key responsibilities for shelter actors when we talk about risk mitigation or engaging on GBV issues. The first one is to be prepared to respond if a survivor comes to you for help. And that basically means we would expect you to have updated referral information and understand how to provide safe and appropriate referrals to services. So we had a set of trainings a few weeks ago on that first resource you see on the left-hand side of the slide. It's a purple pocket guide is what we call it. So the first responsibility for shelter actors is to be able to engage with a survivor or another person at risk of GBV and be able to refer them to someone who can either respond to their case, a GBV specialist, or someone in the community whom they trust. So we have already covered this one, and Akiko has put a link to the pocket guide in the chat. And you can also access that 2-hour training on the GBV AOR YouTube channel. I know if you haven't attended one of those trainings, you will want to listen to those recordings, and you can find those on the GBV AOR's YouTube channel by simply searching for risk mitigation or the pocket guide for Sudan. And today, we're going to discuss the second responsibility for shelter actors. And the second responsibility is to implement programming in a way that minimizes GBV risks. So we're going to focus on that second bullet point today. But first, let's do a brief review of our first responsibility, which is looking at the pocket guide. Next slide, please. Let's look at this video that summarizes our pocket guide. It's good. Oh, no sound. One second. We're just going to get the sound and we'll be tuning in 1 sec.
Akiko, I think you need to reshare your screen and check the box for sharing sound.
While Akiko is doing that, I just want to reiterate that the first responsibility is contained or summarized in our pocket guide, which Akiko has given the link to. And really, the pocket guide is just about how we engage with a survivor or someone at risk of GBV, because it's all of our responsibilities to treat survivors or people at risk with dignity, respect, make sure they're safe, and then also link them to an appropriate service or someone in the community with whom they trust.
Gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is among the most widespread forms of violence. Women and girls are especially vulnerable to GBV, but it can also affect boys, men, adolescents, elderly people, and those with disabilities. This film is for humanitarian workers who may meet people disclosing GBV incidents during humanitarian crisis. GBV incidents are often hidden, and supporting survivors is always complex and sensitive. If a survivor approaches you and discloses an incident, ensure that any urgent needs receive immediate attention and that you're both safe. Listen carefully and treat any information given as confidential. Do not ask details. Do not record any information about the incident or the survivor. Inform the survivor of the options available to them. Only share accurate and up-to-date information about services available in the area and explain how to access them. If you are asked to help contact any type of service, the survivor must understand and agree to who will be informed and what will happen next. This is informed consent. If they give their consent, follow the referral pathway defined by GBV specialists in your area. Respect the survivor's choice. Do not counsel them or try and force assistance. Do inform them that help can also be sought at a later stage. Regardless of if a survivor chooses to access services or not, do not share details of the incidents or personal identifiers unless the survivor asks you to do so. Remember the key principles of safety, consent, confidentiality, and respect. You can only offer support if the incident is disclosed directly to you by the survivor. Under no circumstances should you look for GBV survivors. This can endanger them and yourself. If someone other than the survivor approaches you, give them information about available assistance that they can share with the survivor. explain that safety and confidentiality must be preserved. Training and guidance from GBV specialists are essential to understand how you can assist survivors safely. Ask your manager what's available. You and your team should also be familiar with your agency's code of conduct and know that any sexual exploitation or abuse by humanitarians is strictly prohibited. If unsure of what to do at any point, seek advice from a GBV specialist whilst upholding confidentiality.
Great. So this video was actually developed by the shelter cluster at global level. And I have to say, there are some really good resources that you can find online at the Global Shelter Cluster website. And we're going to go over some of those resources today, or at least present some of them, because I think you have a lot of the tools available. It's just a matter of if we are accessing them to make sure that we are mitigating risks. So just very briefly, what are some of the main points that you took away from that video? You can either write in the chat or you can unmute yourselves. Can anybody help me with some main points from the video that we just watched? What do you think? Some main points from the video. How
From
about?
my side,
Go ahead, Hawa.
from my side, I think it talks more about confidentiality and
Mhm.
protection of the victim.
Yes, very good. Excellent, Hawa. Thank you. So confidentiality. And Samar, you're saying also safety, consent, respect, confidentiality. Really good. Yeah, Amore, if you could even just take away those key principles, then that's a great start to our conversation. When you are engaging with anyone, really, whether it's a survivor of gender-based violence or someone at risk of gender-based violence, it's really important that we adhere to those principles. Good. Any others? Any other key things that came out of it? Yes, I like this. Vincent, it teaches us to have a system in place for referrals, or what is the term link. Referrals is really about what a GBV specialist will often do in the course of their work.
Violence is a
So we like to look at it in terms of linking a survivor or someone at risk to either another service provider, or another person in the community whom they trust. And really, that's where your engagement ends. We don't expect you to become GBV case managers. What we do expect is for you not to ignore someone in crisis who's standing in front of you. Yeah, Jamal, exactly. Make the survivor aware of what help you can give them. And really, the only help that you will provide as a non-GBV specialist will be simply to link them either to a specialized service or someone in the community with whom they trust. And that's it. That's our only expectations in terms of that first responsibility. Yeah, and Amal, I like that you mentioned PSEA, or even the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, which is clearly all of our responsibilities, regardless of what sector we work in. Good. Any questions? If you have any additional questions about that first responsibility, which is what was summarized in the video, you can feel free to access the training we did a few weeks ago on the Pocket Guide. You can find it on our YouTube channel if you search for the GBV AOR. So let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about the dynamics we find when we talk about gender-based violence. Next slide. Oh, I forgot about this. So the shelter cluster, as I mentioned, the shelter cluster is unique, I think, and in some ways ahead of many other clusters, in that you have developed at global level a lot of the tools you might need to successfully mitigate GBV risks or engage with GBV survivors. So these are cutouts that you can find on the global website. And these are really just simple ways and tips for shelter cluster colleagues. So as I mentioned, you can find this. I just found it on the shelter cluster website. And this is the constant companion. And you can see there's a scissor icon. So they've made it so that you can simply download this resource and contextualize it to your context. So great, we already have this. This again is kind of a short version of that pocket guide. So your do's and don'ts, it has a place for you to put contact details and lots of other things. But as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on that second responsibility today. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the second responsibility, we're really talking about mitigating risks in our programs and our interventions. And this is designed so that we don't inadvertently cause harm through our own programs, projects, or interventions. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to use the GBV, what we often refer to as the GBV guidelines. And that's that resource here on the right of your screen. Guidelines for integrating gender-based violence interventions in humanitarian actions. And really, this was developed by the GBV AOR, but more importantly, it was endorsed by the Interagency Standing Committee, or the IASC. So these guidelines are really a set of advice, and we have a checklist in there. We have indicators for each of the clusters. We have background information about needs for each cluster. And so really it's a resource guide for each of the clusters to be able to mitigate GBV risks throughout their interventions. The IASC has signed off on this, which means that every head of agency, and from the UN side to the NGO side, has agreed that these guidelines should be implemented in humanitarian settings. So yes, Jessica, I think this is a great idea because it's all about better programming. But if for some reason you're still not convinced about what we're going to talk about today, just note that since these guidelines have been endorsed by the IASC, this also means that the heads of your agencies have also signed off on these principles. or what we're going to go over today, reducing risks for women and girls who are at risk of GBV. And we have another little video that we can play that will give you, just so that we don't have to talk in depth about the resource in general, we have a video that'll help us do that.
Imani is alone, in the middle of a crisis. An earthquake has taken everything: her home, her family, and her way of life. Basic community services to protect her health and security have been disrupted. She is exposed to the danger of gender-based violence, GBV.
But you can help keep her safe, even save her life. By implementing the new IASC gender-based violence guidelines, you can help protect Imani from GBV, promote the resilience of her community to reduce the risks she faces, and ensure that she knows where to get appropriate care when she needs it.
There are millions of people like Imani who are threatened by GBV. It is one of the most common human rights abuses in the world, happening anywhere and at any time.
Whether you realized it or not, you will likely have encountered GBV survivors and perpetrators during your work and in your daily life. Some are people you know.
Worldwide, women and girls face a high risk of GBV. In fact, 1 in 3 women will experience sexual or physical violence in their lifetime. This risk can be even higher in crisis-affected settings. But you, as a humanitarian worker, can help turn the tide.
You might think tackling GBV always requires specialist skills. It doesn't.
You might also think that it's not really your responsibility, but it is. It is the responsibility of all humanitarian personnel. All that's required is commitment and understanding. It's doing the work you already do, in ways that are safe for everyone.
This is where the guidelines come in. No matter what sector you work in, you can help prevent GBV and help save and protect the life of a girl like Imani. Survivors and those at risk of GBV are often afraid to speak up. You can help them find their voice.
You don't need to be a GBV specialist to use the guidelines. They offer short, practical, and simple recommendations to help you identify and reduce GBV risk and implement safer programming within your day-to-day work.
The guidelines follow the humanitarian program cycle to offer useful tips on integrating GBV prevention into assessment, resource mobilization, implementation, coordination, and monitoring and evaluation.
The guidelines promote awareness and understanding of GBV, vital to developing safer programs.
The new guidelines draw on 10 years of experience and the latest in best practice to provide an action-based, effective reference for all humanitarians.
The comprehensive guidelines book is also split into 13 sectors, each having its own standalone thematic area guide, or tag. You can use whole guidelines or just the tag that applies to your sector. They provide you with positive, practical recommendations to complement your experience and program priorities.
We're all responsible for reducing the risks of GBV that vulnerable people like Imani face every day. By delivering safe, participatory and sustainable programs, we can reduce risks, promote resilience and aid recovery in communities we serve.
Start implementing the GBV guidelines today. Download the main book or the tag for your sector at www.gbvguidelines.org now.
Yes. We are, in fact, going to start today. Through this training, through our time together, I'm going to introduce you to some of the elements of those guidelines and also to some of your own tools that were developed through the global shelter cluster so that we can mitigate risks.
Sustainable development demands the best ideas of everyone, everywhere. Yet many good ideas never get off the ground.
That's all right. That's okay. We've got some technical. Okay. So let's then, as Akiko's getting our screens back up, let's think about some key terms though, that will help us contextualize what I mean by gender-based violence. First, I want to talk about power. We can't talk about gender-based violence.
Projects. SS Gate is a United Nations initiative. that
Akiko, I think
provides
this
a
is the
global
website that
platform
you
for
showed the
technology.
latest video. You need to close the window of that website. Yeah, this one.
I'm so ready. Okay, coming back to power. So let's talk about power, because power is really at the root of gender-based violence. Next slide. Okay, who can help me read the first set of bullet points under power? Can I have a volunteer to read the first set of bullet points? Great. Nuseba, go ahead.
Power, the ability to control and access resources, opportunities, and decision-maker process.
Mm-hmm.
It can be both real or perceived. Gender is an important determinant of power.
Excellent. Actually, you did so well. Do you mind reading informed consent as well?
Sure. Making an informed choice freely and voluntary by person in an equal power relationship. Acts of GBV occur when there is no informed consent.
Yep.
Children under age 18 are unable to give informed consent for acts such as female genital cutting, FGC, marriage and sexual relation, etc.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, perfect. So power, or the lack of power, is directly related to gender-based violence. When we talk about the ability to control and access resources, opportunities, and decision-making, we're also talking about the very services that are delivered through the shelter cluster. What resources does the shelter cluster deliver? It's a big one. What resource does the shelter cluster deliver? It's pretty obvious. You can write it in the chat. What kind of resources does the shelter cluster deliver? Because you're also in, yeah, Sally, thanks. Hey, Sally, nice to see you on the line. That's exactly right. One of our most basic needs, you all deliver. Shelter. IDPs and Sudanese can't live without shelter. Zainab, does the shelter cluster also distribute food, or is that food security cluster? Water, NFIs, Ibrahim. Yeah, NFIs. What about your shelter cluster kits? So you all have the power to determine whether an individual has access to housing. That's a huge responsibility. And with it comes huge amounts of risk. I like Mohammed. I love what you said, Mohammed. Establishment of community-based protection networks, which should be done with the shelter cluster. Exactly. Emergency shelter kits, excellent. Samar, I like this. So access to resources, you said site development. This also speaks to access to opportunities. You have the power to determine where people live, whether they live close to a water site, whether they live close to a school, whether they live close to a food distribution site. It's a lot of power you have in your work every day. The impact that you have on women and girls cannot be understated. And this is why informed consent is so important. The ability for women and girls and men and boys who are at risk of gender-based violence to make choices freely and voluntarily with people or persons in an equal power relationship. And that second bullet point is really critical. Acts of GBV occur when there is no informed consent and when there are individuals with unequal power. Just by the fact that you are all joining me in this webinar today means that you have power over people in the community. It is our responsibility to make sure that we don't abuse that power, either purposely or inadvertently. And we must always come back to the humanitarian principle of do no harm. I like Altaj is saying, can you please give us an example of equal power? And in this situation, no, probably not. When we're talking about IDPs who are at risk, no. Just by the fact that they are IDPs puts them in an unequal power relationship, which is why we have to be so cognizant or aware of the impact of our services and interventions at or site level. So an equal power relationship might be between, when we take away those risk factors, we might have more of an equal power relationship. But right now, what I'm hearing about the current situation in Sudan is that very few people would have the resources, money, education, access that would put them in an equal power relationship. And that's a particular and especially when we talk about women and girls. So Mohammed, I liked that you asked that question. But in fact, at this current time, it would be hard. I think we would be very hard pressed to find people in an equal power relationship. John has a question. Is perceived presence of informed consent always mean the absence of GBV? No. Really good question, John, and a really thoughtful one. No. When we talk about consent, real or perceived, if we have someone who is distributing shelter kits and they say to a woman, if you have sex with me, I will give you this kit. And the woman agrees or consents. This is gender-based violence. Because she didn't have power in that engagement or intervention to say no. She knew that if she didn't say yes, she would not have access to shelter. So she said yes in words, but she didn't have a choice, and she didn't have power in that situation to say no. And that's why it's gender-based violence. Even when they could seemingly be informed about all of the potential choices. As John, I think, is saying here, you could still have incidences of gender-based violence. And I think it's really important for us to realize that it's not always about real manifestations of power. It's not always about someone holding a weapon or a gun. It can also be perceived power. And that's probably more relevant to all of us here on the call today. Yes, Sally. Informed consent requires availability of choice. That was a really good way of framing that. Really good. Informed consent requires the availability of choice. Yeah, great. So let's see how now, let's talk about some of those risks I was just alluding to. Next slide, please. What are some of the risks that we often encounter or that you have identified through your work as shelter cluster members? What GBV risks have you identified? You can either write in the chat or you can raise your hand or unmute yourselves. What are some of the risks that have been identified through your work? Gender-based violence risks. Any thoughts? Specific to shelter. What do you think? What are some risks associated with shelter? Anybody have any thoughts? Okay, I don't see anybody with their hand raised. Yes, Eva, go ahead.
Thanks. Maybe I can come in from the perspective of the cluster coordinator.
Great.
Yeah, I would say that what's quite limiting for us at this level, which kind of reduces the power that you were talking about, that we have to address this GBV risks in a comprehensive manner, is the fact that we are often limited to implementing emergency shelter interventions by OCHA and the HCT. And the emergency shelters, while critical in providing immediate refuge and basic protection from the elements, are often fall short in effectively mitigating the GBV risk. The materials used in construction of these shelters are often driven by the urgency of the situation or the resource constraints. They're typically very flimsy and can be easily broken into by hand, which is rendering locks that we may want to provide only minimally effective. And these shelters are constructed using translucent or see-through materials, which not only compromises the privacy, but also poses a distinct security threat, especially for women. The visibility into the shelter can advertise when a woman might be home alone, making her a potential target. Now, donors, HET members, and especially OCHA prioritize funding only for emergency type shelters, limiting our ability to address these risks adequately. And Akiko is my witness. I keep having this battle with them for years. Crucial initiatives like durable shelter, like street lighting, all of these are sidelined as development activities. And this stance misinterprets the life-saving nature of GBV-focused interventions. So yeah, I guess this is just my urgent call for kind of amplified support at the global and regional levels to challenge this narrow view, because our kind of own advocacy is not sufficient, and we hope for kind of unified advocacy to shift these perceptions. Thanks.
Good. Thank you. Akiko, I see you have your hand raised as well. Over to you, Akiko.
Yes, thank you everyone. So I would really like to echo what Eva, mentioned. Okay. Maybe I should. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. So I would really like to echo what Eva mentioned, and I witnessed a lot that she's been really strongly advocating for durable shelters, like some more like something more durable and safe, solutions for all the IDPs, but refugees, but also for particularly for women and the girls. I fully agree with the need for the joint advocacy, because this, I see that there is a really significant shortage of funding to address this issue. So I just wanted to say that great work, Eva, but we would really like to join advocating for more safe shelters, durable shelters, something that really helps beneficiaries, particularly women and girls. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Akiko. And we're getting some really great responses here in the chat. One that I think we can all, which actually hurts my heart, is when I hear about SEA, sexual exploitation and abuse during distributions. Luang, you said here, SEA is a looming occurrence during shelter distribution. And that's us, right? That means that's us. That's humanitarian. Whether it's not you on this call, it could be one of your implementing partners, one of your colleagues. So SEA distribution, or during distributions, I saw, as Eva mentioned, we had others who have also reiterated the issue about materials that are used to make shelters. And this is a big one as well. These community leaders acting as gatekeepers. And that's about the types of shelters where people are. And then, as was mentioned, Jamal saying that it could lead to unjust distribution of shelter services and render some women left behind, because almost all of these community leaders are also male. Overcrowding, Miriam, I see you. I see you. Yes, overcrowding, particularly when merging or splitting households. Also, the lost capacity to make decisions that determine where to live or the characteristics of their shelter or homes. Really good, Miriam, good ones. Hawa, mostly happens from community leaders side by threatening not to get services. Yep. Hawa's reiterating the role of gatekeepers. So important. We didn't also, I have a few pictures that I have gathered from the websites of some of our partners who are operating in Sudan. I want us to look at some of these. What do we see here? So this is a picture of a shelter that was taken in the eastern part of Sudan. This is an actual shelter. What do we think? I mean, Eva, you kind of characterized a lot, right? But anybody else? What do you think when I see this picture from a GBV perspective? What do you think?
It's not safe and people can see through it. And there's limited privacy. And it's not, if it's the humanitarian sector supporting, we can do much better to support people in having a safe and dignified space.
Yeah, thank you. Yep, that's exactly right. And this isn't a collective settlement. So it's one that's known by the UN and supported by the UN and the cluster system. Yeah. Good. Really good, Asia. Thank you. How about let's look at a distribution, because also partly, right, I would say the second half of your sort of interventions often center around distributions of NFIs. And again, this is a picture I took from one of our partners. You can kind of see who might be associated with that partner. Yeah, Hiba, what do you think from this picture? This is an NFI distribution. Hiba, do you see
Yes,
any potential risks?
yes, as you said before, males are the one responsible for distribution, so there should be some female to be with them to make it more justice and reduce the PCA or sexual risk for sexual harassment risk for the female refugees or IDPs.
Yeah, good, Hiba. This is a simple intervention that can have a huge impact. Studies have shown that just by having women present and actively participating in the distribution team, we can lower the risk of SEA, or sexual exploitation and abuse. Full stop. And I know that sounds really simple, and we're talking about it constantly, but it's a fact. That's a fact. We know for a fact that when women are active participants of the distribution team, then SEA is reduced, at least at the point of contact. Now, whether SEA is reduced in further points of the distribution, we can't be sure. But at the distribution itself, and Hiba, I'm glad you mentioned that. I specifically chose this picture because you see there's a man obviously overseeing it. What else do you see here in this picture that might make you a little nervous about risk? Anything? Any other potential GBV risks here? Nuseba, go ahead.
I think the item which distributed is very heavy for women to handle. So she will make a deal or negotiation with men to support her. I think it is a potential of GBV.
Yeah, really good. Gosh, you guys are good. Yeah, exactly. Look at this guy to the left of the screen here. He's struggling just to pick those up to redistribute them. Imagine if you were a woman who then had to walk 6 or 7 kilometers to get this NFI back to your shelter. How would that happen? And maybe women who are abled would be able to do that. But we haven't even started talking about persons with disabilities, elderly heads of households who would find it much more difficult. Howa, you have your hand raised again. Go ahead.
Yeah, I see some items are missing from some sets.
Howa, we have lost you. Okay, we'll come back. Luang, you had, or Chacha, what do you think? You had your hand raised.
You can hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm saying I see some items are missing, like some are complete sets and others are not.
So you're worried that each kit isn't the same for everyone.
Yeah.
Okay. And that could be a potential worry, right? Because we saw that power dynamics directly relate to the distribution or access to resources. Yep. Yeah. Any other risk factors here? I think this is a little bit of, okay, go ahead. Stella, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. I think the arrangement of the distribution, like when you see those women who are standing inside, we don't know exactly who are, whether there are some men inside. So the position of standing when the distribution is going on is also a risk. That is what I totally assume here.
Yeah, I'd want to know more. Exactly. Thanks, Stella. I'd want to know more about how this, as you can see, there's a whole group of women standing to the side with lots of men sort of directing them. And I'd want to know what happens next. This looks like a very enclosed space. They go out. And as someone else mentioned, as soon as you leave with anything of value, you're at risk, especially in a really high stakes environment like the Sudan right now, where there are so many people in need. Al-Rashid, go ahead. I see your hand raised. Abdallah? Al-Rashid Abdallah. Yeah, go ahead. I see your hand raised. Okay. So.
Okay, I get back. Thank
Go
you
ahead.
for the chance. Okay, I think also the spaces is very crowded for the women to be in this very small spaces. I think it make a kind of risk for them. So we need to be enough spaces, and the item must be organized by numbers, like 10 every 10 women to come and get their NFIs and leave the area. Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really
Okay.
good insight. Yes. Yep. I'm worried about how this is actually going to take place because each of the distributions look very organized. But how does that look in practice when we actually do the distribution? And I think, Shadrach, you're saying there's probably no fast track line and waiting shelter for people living with disabilities and other vulnerabilities. Yep, this is exactly it. I like Amal, who's saying, why don't we drive to their home and start a new distribution policy that we go to them rather than they having to walk 6-7 kilometers to us? Yeah. And I guess that's a challenge to all of you. Yeah. So
Sorry.
1 second. If you want to have if you would like to say something, you can also raise your hand as well. Iqbal, go ahead. Go ahead. Okay. I don't see that we've gone off mic again. So next slide. Let's look at the next slide because we actually have to get to our resources too. I could do this all day. Again, so okay, we now have a distribution, right? One of our issues with the previous slide was this enclosed space. Okay, so it looks like this organization said, let's take it outside. Let's do it in a more open space. But what do we see? What do we see here? Iqbal, go ahead. I see that you wanted to say something.
Yes, I said it seemed like an inhuman way to throw aid into the ground. This picture.
This new one here. Yeah,
You
probably
don't...
both of them, right? Yeah, I like this. Iqbal is saying, what about the dignity of those we are there to support? Osman, you have another comment? Go ahead.
This is Yusuf.
Okay, go ahead. We've got lots of people off mic.
Actually,
Go ahead.
the women in thank you. Really, recently we joined the so that's great, amazing information regarding. Yeah, actually, as we see that this is the open side. It is not the previous, not like the previous one. And the second thing is not consider the dignity of the women at the, the rolling in this place. Also, this is maybe likely to make them for the another external factor, for example, for their safety when they take their materials item that for the shelter. So over. To you. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Another good reflection. So what I see here, right? Some of the issues we had with the last picture was it seemed like an enclosed space. We're not sure how the distribution was going to take place. Fewer women. Access was unsure. How do persons living with disabilities access that site in the previous picture? So I purposely found this one, which is outside. To be honest, this one makes me more nervous. As many of you mentioned, again, I'm seeing only males who are kind of lingering, who seem to be part of distribution. Doreen, really good reflection. There seem to be fewer items than recipients. There seem to be a few hundred recipients outside of that line. And there certainly aren't a few hundred kits right here. That makes me nervous. Crowd control, Usman, yep. And again, they're controlling the inner part of it. But what about as soon as they cross that barrier? What's going to happen to those women? And this one seemingly seems to be in the middle of nowhere, which also makes me nervous. Yes, there's more space, but where are they? Amal saying she sees soldiers. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. And also that makes me nervous as well. Mohammed, you have your hand raised. Go ahead. Mohammed Dahab. Mohammed Dahab, you have your hand raised. Would you like to give a reflection? Okay. While we wait for Mohammed, how about Abbas? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for this chance. I think this distribution is in open area, but the cloud control is not well because I saw all those are standing there, and there is barrier between the beneficiaries and the items. So it's best that the men can. I saw the men in right hand, and also there's women and also men in the left hand. So all them are standing and stood. I think that it's better to be some in open area in schedule, and men and can stand away from the women because we cannot sure that they will be in same hand. Thank you.
Thanks, Abbas. Yeah, as I mentioned, this one actually makes me more nervous than the previous one. So lots of things that have been mentioned so far. I see some hands, but I'm going to have to save your hands, or please write your comments in the chat. Mohammed and Hawa, if you could write your comments in the chat, because I'm realizing that we have a lot to cover and not so much time left. So we've recognized some of the risks. Crowd control, that there are too many people and not enough of the NFI kits. I'm going to call them kits. Yep. That most of the people, or seemingly running the distribution, are male. The location of the distribution is also a worry. I want to also note that many of those risks that you all have identified, really, with the exception of the number of kits available, the other ones don't require any additional funding to mitigate. Does that make sense? With the exception of having more kits available. Certainly it would cost more money to have more kits be available. But the distribution, the registration, the makeup of the distribution team to mitigate those risks would not cost any additional money. But it would force us to be more thoughtful about how we do our daily business. Okay, next slide, please. And last picture is really of another, this is just to show housing in a broader context. And please do write in the chat, but I think we had a lot of comments already, how inadequate this is. Eva, you mentioned the lack of, I mean, how can you lock this? Really, right? We can talk about locks, but when you have a tarpaulin that can be cut with a knife, and really there's no door, Amal is saying just the quality of the tent. This is really a tarpaulin that's been turned into a tent, right? It also, I see lots of young men around. There doesn't seem to be a separation, for instance. What are some ways? Yep, there's no identified place for person with specific needs during the distribution. I see that from the previous one. The shelter is not well prepared. Aya, good one. Yeah. And there are ways, and I see that you're saying, Eva's saying, unfortunately, this is what OCHA, the HCT, and donors are pushing for. They call them light repair kits. This is because we don't have funding to support more than 5% of those in need. So Eva's making a good point. And I think from a GBV risk mitigation perspective, we're probably not going to be able to change the makeup of the shelters. But we can reduce the protection risks that women and girls are exposed to. And that really speaks to about how we organize a camp. And also, do we have community-based protection mechanisms in place? So yeah, I get it that people are saying, well, these are the materials that we can afford. But we know that people have, you know, lived in tents or camped in tents before and not been raped. And that speaks to the environment in which these tents are pitched. And we're going to talk about that as well. Next slide. So, ways that we can mitigate risks. I want us to quickly go through this because I want to come back to that question I just asked. So I'm even going to write this question in the chat, Akiko. How can we control the environment in terms of protecting women and girls from GBV risks? I want us to all think about that over the next 30 minutes. If we are unable in the short term to change the quality of the materials that are distributed, how can we control the environment in which those people are living? We do have some control over that. Shelter does, along with camp management, right? That we can control. And those interventions don't actually take a lot of money. So think about that as I go through. Hey, Sally. Sally's already giving us some ideas. Separate women and girls. Create spaces, Hussein, Mohammed. Create spaces for women and girls. The reality is, even in the most secure shelters, women and girls are being raped in IDP sites. And that speaks to the environment, and we can control some of that. Okay. Tivan, I see that your hand is raised. If I could ask you to please put your comment in the chat, because I'm now running behind time, because I can talk about this for ages, to be honest. Yeah. Sally is giving some really great suggestions in the chat about how we can make the environment safer for women and girls if they have to live in that shelter. Okay. So I want us, though, to really take note of some of the available resources to help us go through this. As we mentioned, the guidelines are really a set of thematic area guides for each of the sectors. As you can see here on the right of the screen, there is a specific guide or tag for shelter, settlement, and recovery. And so this is really, you can just download the tag for shelter or the thematic area guide. You don't even need to download the entire thing. So what we've done is really extracted each of the chapters so that they're smaller and specific to each cluster. And they contain these essential actions. So if you're unsure about how to go about mitigating the risks that we have just identified, this is a resource that can help you. And Akiko has already put the link to this guide specifically for shelter cluster organizations in the link. And I love that we are getting so many really thoughtful answers in the chat about ways that we can mitigate risks just by controlling the environment better. Shekelden, physical environment should be in a place, with proper coordination between actors. Really good. Yeah, excellent. So it should be clean for sure, safe latrines. Hiba's saying we can even simply raise awareness about what GBV is. Yeah, so John, I like this. You're saying controlling the environment is not enough. It has to be accompanied with awareness raising, for sure. And we're talking a lot today about short-term practical ways that you can mitigate risks tomorrow. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, there is a specific thematic guide for shelter cluster organizations. And it really the guidelines are centered around the humanitarian program cycle. And so it's about assessments, resource mobilization, implementation, coordination, monitoring, and evaluation. So each of these 5 areas are addressed in the thematic guide. So when you're developing proposals, for instance, if you have a SURF proposal coming up, please do look into the guidelines. We have gender progressive indicators that look at GBV risk. We have questions you can adapt and incorporate into any assessments you're doing. We give really good tips about coordination, which was said here in the chat. But let's look at the first one, assessments. So all of you identified what you perceived as risks. But let's look at what women and girls have identified as risks themselves. So, the GBV AOR did a series of focus group discussions and safety audits in April of 2023. And there were reflections on shelter. Who can help me read what some of these reflections are? Who can read the first set here? Inappropriate shelter. Go ahead, Victoria.
Appropriate shelter infrastructure. Schools originally designed for educational purposes may lack the necessary facilities to ensure the privacy and safety of displaced individuals. Insufficient partitions or separate living spaces can expose residents, particularly women and girls, to increased risk of GBV.
Good. So inappropriate shelter infrastructure. Victoria, do you want to read the next one?
Yes. Overcrowding. The high concentration of IDPs within limited shelter spaces intensifies the risk of GBV incidents. Overcrowding can lead to heightened tensions and conflicts, making it harder to maintain a safe and insecure environment.
Yep, that tracks, doesn't it? Many of you mentioned overcrowding as a risk factor, and almost all of you mentioned the shelter infrastructure. And how about the third one? Victoria, go ahead.
Adequate lighting. The absence or inadequacy of lighting during nighttime can create an environment conducive to GBV. Dimly lit areas increase the vulnerability of individuals, particularly women and girls, by reducing by making it harder. Sorry.
To
By
identify.
making it harder to identify potential threats.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. And Usman, can you read the last one for us? Osman, go ahead. Abdulmatalib. He's back on. Abbas, you can read the last one. Go ahead.
Lack of privacy. The absence of private space within the sheltering facilities compresses the dignity and safety of displaced individuals. The lack of privacy can contribute to the instance of GBV, as survivors may feel hesitant to report or seek assistance due to the constant presence of others.
Good. Thank you. Thanks, Abbas. Good. So let's talk. Inappropriate shelter infrastructure. And really, this one, I think, comes down to lack of privacy and safety. So this has been overwhelmingly one of the risks, hasn't it? This lack of privacy and safety. Certainly, the materials we are using as shelter impacts this. But as I mentioned, I think that environment is even more critical. The next one, and this one we haven't heard so much about, inadequate lighting. Who's responsible within the humanitarian community for providing lighting in the settlements or camps or sites, collection sites? Who is responsible? Because this is where we often have issues. Who's responsible? Any thoughts? Okay, local authorities. But really in practice, I mean, we could say the local government, that the government is responsible for all of this, really, right? The government should be providing shelter. The government should be providing safe access to water. The government should be providing food. But who in practice within the humanitarian community should be providing lighting? Yeah, in refugee camps, UNHCR. But what about in these settlements? Who's responsible? Yep, I know. Awesome. Yeah, real easy to identify in a refugee setting, UNHCR. But I'm asking, which sector is responsible for lighting in a non-refugee setting? Oh, Hussein is saying shelter. Okay. I like that Jamal's saying the protection sector. No. I mean, it would be really unusual for us to get funding for infrastructure of a camp setting. And nor would camp coordination allow us to seek funding for lighting. Yeah, Mohammed's saying site planning, but who's responsible for that ultimately? Hussein is saying shelter, the local community. And again, the local community, right? We could say the same. They're responsible for water. They're responsible for latrines. But in practice, within the humanitarian community, I'm going to leave that question dangling. Who's responsible for that lighting? Mohammed, you keep saying the protection cluster, but the protection cluster is not. So the protection cluster would never get funding to help strengthen infrastructure of a camp. For instance, the protection cluster would not get money to buy locks for shelters. And nor would the shelter cluster want us to do that. Does that make sense? The lack of lighting has led to a protection concern, but the protection cluster is not responsible for lighting camps. Yeah. And Eva, how about Eva, if you want to come off, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So yeah, I just wanted to say that definitely it is the shelter and NFI cluster, but as I mentioned, street lighting is considered a development activity, hence we receive no funding for that, sadly. On the other hand, the solar lamp is part of the standard NFI kit, and there are 7 types of items, but many of the other items have a larger quantity. So for example, in a kit which has 16 individual items, one item, the solar lamp, takes up 25% of the cost. So sadly, it's the first item that partners drop due to lack of funding, unfortunately. And there seemed to be more focus on quantity rather than quality. And there is strong focus on the perceived kind of response at larger scale at the cost of quality again. And then just one last point is that it's important to stress that this is an urban response. We have 70% of 5 million new IDPs living with a host community in urban areas. So it's really broader than the shelter and NFI cluster. Of course, CCCM has nothing to do with this. And we really require a close collaboration with development actors to address these issues, because we not only lack funding, but also the tools and expertise to respond at urban displacement of this scale. Thanks.
Thanks, Eva. Good clarifications. Good. So I like what you're saying. I mean, like is a strong word, but it resonates what you said in terms of the solar lamps being the most expensive item and the first one that are dropped. Which also makes me understand that we have to do better advocacy around issues like that from the protection sector. When we talk about risk mitigation and having concrete recommendations, those are the kind of things I think that are really powerful for us to also keep in mind. And also our shelter cluster members who are applying for funding and with the need to justify why we put those into our proposals. Good. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, Al-Rashid, go ahead. Abdallah, you have a question.
Okay, I didn't have a question, but I have a comment in the who's responsible for the shelter side. I think for the long time we are working in Darfur since 2006, and many times we are talking about the shelter quality. We are talking within the government line like HAG and other sectors, but every time they answer our questions that there is not enough spaces for the IDPs come, and there is no additional funding to really relocate it. Some IDPs come for the other area to meet the minimum standard of the sphere standard that the spices of the shelter itself. So the shelter cluster is need more discussion and more advocacy within the government line to meet the minimum standard and to meet the humanitarian dignity in the many areas, not only for the Darfurian areas, but also in the White Nile and Al-Gadarif and many other Sudanese refugees and IDPs hosting areas. So we need to make it sense and talking closely with all stakeholders to reassess the area of the IDPs and refugees come to see how it can meet the minimum standard of like the sphere standard or other standard guidance. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thanks, Abdallah. Some good reflection points. And then that's recognized. But I also want us to come back to maybe what we can control. Because I think all of us are recognizing that the shelters are inadequate. But that still shouldn't be a gateway for sexual assault, physical assault. And that again speaks to the environment and also the ability to for perpetrators to be able to access vulnerable and at-risk women. I want us to look at this cluster response priority. So I looked over your HRP, your revised one, and I did see in your main impact and needs, it was mentioned. Let's see. It says as part of one of your needs or the impact of this crisis, immediate provision of shelter will be critical to ensure privacy and safety. Oh, Eva, I see you. Mitigate GBV risks and safeguard. Safeguard is often a term we use not only about from harsh environment conditions, but also for SEA, to be honest. And safeguard displaced populations from harsh environmental conditions to preserve their health amid the upcoming rainy seasons. And this is a positive. This stated in your revised HRP is an opportunity for donors to understand what these needs are. But in terms of what you identified as response priorities, it wasn't quite as clear. So in your cluster response plan, you did identify GBV risks as a need or mitigating GBV risks as a need. But unfortunately, when we look at response priorities, it wasn't as clearly articulated. And so that's one area I think that our GBV guidelines can help strengthen some of that analysis. It's really important that we as a cluster incorporate this in our HRP plans so then that partners know and donors know that it is a priority. So there's an opportunity, but we need to follow through with that, with the identification of a priority. And that's what we're doing, I think, today. It wasn't articulated so much in the HRP, but we're doing it today. And I know that Akiko is writing down some of our main recommendations for response priorities that we will share with everyone after this discussion. Okay. I realize that we have about 20 minutes left, so I want us to get through to the next few resources because the shelter cluster has done well in developing resources. And I just wanted to also identify some of the common GBV risk factors that were identified in some of the guidance that was produced at global level. And you'll see that unfortunately, the risks that you identified in Sudan seem to be universal across the world. The next 3 slides, we will be discussing global tools that were developed by the shelter cluster specifically to reduce the risk of gender-based violence. So these are global tools that you can adapt or contextualize for the Sudan context. But I think it's really telling that in the global guidance, the risks that they identified are also the risks you identified. And that means these risks have been ongoing for a long time. And you in Sudan can be part of this solution. You can come up with some amazing, innovative ways to reduce these risks. And those lessons can be taken and shared globally. And I say innovative, but in fact, many of the ways that we can reduce risk are very practical and simple. And we're going to get to those. So again, overcrowded living conditions, poorly designed shelters, insufficient or inadequate assistance, poor selection of beneficiaries and communication, and poorly organized distributions of shelters and non-food items. So partly that depresses me a little bit, that this guidance that was developed years ago and the risks that this guidance was developed for are still ongoing in so many contexts here today at this very moment. So please note, many of you listed risks specifically associated with site planning. There is guidance available on the Global Shelter website, and actually we can even put those links in the chat so that you have the links to all of these, or you can simply go to the global website. Oh, Akiko, she's way ahead of me. Akiko just put in the chat the link to site planning. So really, your shelter cluster colleagues have made my job easy. The guidance is there. It's now about implementing it in practical ways to reduce risks in Sudan.
I come there.
Yeah. Stella, if you want to, you can raise your hand and then I can call on you. Okay. So this is global guidance on site planning. Next slide, please. Oh, look at this. We have another set of guidance specific to the distribution of shelter materials, NFI, and cash. You guys are good. Every component of risk that was identified, you have guidance already developed that can help you reduce those risks. And we're going to also, in our last 10 minutes, review some very practical ways we can reduce risk tomorrow. Let's see, you also produced this very nice video that looks at, I want us to watch the video and to really think about key takeaways from the video that you could incorporate into your own programming starting tomorrow.
Crisis, people have been displaced. You work for an organisation providing emergency assistance. For first phase response, you are planning an NFI distribution. The distribution team should include women and people from different groups. The team composition should not put anyone at risk. Consult with the affected populations to identify their needs and work out the best time and location for the distribution. Don't ask questions about difficult experiences when there is nothing you can do to help. Be careful not to give people false expectations or make people more at risk. Make sure you talk to everyone you need to, including the local authorities. Choose distribution locations that are safe for everybody. A poor site might lead to increased exposure to sexual violence or possible confrontation with the host population. Once there is a plan, keep everyone informed. Use distributions to conduct training and share important messages. Have clear criteria for deciding who should be prioritised at the time of the distribution. Identify people who will need help with transport and with building shelters. Ensure that you and the other team members know what to do if they come across persons who've experienced gender-based violence and what services they can be referred to. Your team should be familiar with their agency's code of conduct. Sexual exploitation or abuse of beneficiaries is strictly prohibited. To ensure that people can bring specific needs to your attention, set up a complaints area. Conduct post-distribution monitoring to check that the distribution has met the needs, including those of vulnerable groups. Remember, for a successful distribution, represent affected populations in the distribution team. Ask affected populations and local authorities what their needs are. Communicate with everybody. Identify vulnerable groups and specific needs of individuals to ensure safety, dignity, and access to NFIs for all. Know how and where to safely refer survivors of gender-based violence, including sexual exploitation or abuse by humanitarian staff. Of course, non-food item distribution alone will seldom meet all emergency shelter needs. What else can you do to provide support to people? Please visit gbvguidelines.org and sheltercluster.org for more information.
Whew. There's shelter again. As I said, you guys have some really good resources available that reinforce everything that we are talking about today. What are some of the key takeaways from that video that you can incorporate into your programming or your interventions quite readily? What do you think? What are some of the key messages from that video? Go ahead, Victoria. No? Okay. Or you can write in the chat. What are some of the key? I saw one that I really liked, and I'll write it in the chat. It's important that we have representation, right? Have a site plan. I like this, Jamal. Determine criteria for distribution of vulnerable groups prior to. Yep. So determine criteria. Good. Site plan. What else? Any others? Yep. Make sure that we have a plan in place to help people with special needs. I think a point that came out over and over was really the need to have representation on the distribution team. Yes, proper registration. So not only do we need to make sure that there is criteria for vulnerable populations, but we also need to have registration. Yep. It reinforced the pocket guide. Very good. Safe space for distribution and provide transportation. Stella, NFIs are kept at a distance, but at a safe distance. Good. Yeah, even more so, ask people what they need, particularly for NFI distributions. We know that a lot of NFI distributions are directly linked to GBV. Oftentimes because women and girls are receiving items that they don't necessarily prioritize, so they have to sell those items, or else trade those items away for other more needed items. We also know the incidences of SCA, or sexual exploitation and abuse, are greater when we have a resource that is given away. Yeah, I like that, Victoria. Overall, mainstreaming protection contributes to risk reduction. We could just end with that. That's a good one. But we can't. We have a few more slides. And I want us to come away with this, from this discussion, with some key recommendations. I hate to say recommendations because that's something that we want you to do, but with some key actions that you will do starting tomorrow. But first, I want to show you the third resource that you can access. So Shelter Cluster has also developed a toolkit for good programming. This toolkit includes tools on assessment of risk mitigation, responding to GBV incidents, which is really just a reinforcement of the pocket guide. Remember, we do not expect our shelter colleagues to engage or do case management for a GBV survivor. Our only expectation is that you treat them with respect, dignity, confidentiality, and then link them to a service or someone whom they trust. And lastly, to support better shelter programming. Who can read that last paragraph for me? That it says the toolkit supports. Who can help me here? Victoria, go ahead. Or Amal. Sorry, I see Amal's hand is raised. And we haven't heard from Amal yet. Go ahead.
Okay, the toolkit supports the interagency standing committee guidelines for integrating gender-based violence intervention in humanitarian action and aims to conceptualize this as advice given the practical way for shelter settlement and recovery paradigms.
Good, thank you, Amal. So what your colleagues at global level have done is taken our guidelines, that thematic guideline that I showed you, and really contextualized it, and also went beyond and provided tools, practical tools that you can use to assess risk. When we look at also responding to GBV incidents, like the, what do we call it in that? The companion, I think it was called, we were calling it the constant companion, I think, which we saw in the beginning, which was just a simply folded brochure that you can take with you. And then also how you're going to do or support better shelter programming. Akiko has put a link to that toolkit in the chat. Which brings us now to the end of our discussion, but maybe the most important part of our discussion. Next slide, please. We have about 5 minutes left. I want us to think about what we can do tomorrow to mitigate the risks that you have identified. You've already come up with actually some really good suggestions, but I want us to come up with a list right now. And this is this is about us setting expectations. Zainab is saying, prepare for the distribution areas. Yeah. So let's be specific. based on what we have discussed, when we talk about distribution points, something very practical that you can do tomorrow when we're doing NFI distributions. We can assess the site for accessibility. That can be done, for sure. We know that we also, really good, Osam Suleiman, we need to involve females in the distribution. That can happen tomorrow. Whether it's through volunteers or, I hope you all have staff already that are females. That's two. Zainab is saying, what about crowd control? For sure. But let's be very practical. A lot of you are mentioning about program cycles and sphere standards. Yes. I consider those a bit longer term, and I don't want us to forget those, but I want us to come away from this discussion with very practical actions about how you will mitigate risks tomorrow. And that won't cost any money. One is that we can control the distribution site, whether we're doing better crowd control, location accessibility, and we need to make sure that females are a part of the distribution. That will not cost you any additional money. It does require that you are thoughtful and that you take into account the protection of women and girls. What else? What about shelter? We have about 3 or 4 minutes left here. So we've hit now on NFI distributions. We've come up with 3, let's say 4, very practical ways that you can mitigate risks starting tomorrow with no cost or additional cost to your programming. Let's talk about shelter. What can we do? What does PWSN mean? I see some. What do you think? Stella, do you have a practical, I'm only taking practical suggestions on what you can do tomorrow. We've had quite a few longer term, which is great, but I'm talking about tomorrow. Go ahead, Stella.
I think when we talk particularly on the shelter, we will see the design that reflects to the two gender, the male and the female. So practically, we are looking at a design that can't create a conflict and a distance between any existing shelter to either an open space, or should be really reasonable, that will never cause any trouble to women. So partitions are normally created in the shelter construction to ensure that some of these risks are mitigated in form of a privacy, and women are given their privacy. At the same time, we also introduce windows and doors, and these doors and the windows in any shelter must be closed so that it also reduce issues that are subjecting both genders to a risk. And this is the practical situation that we in the shelter sector, we are looking at it as a mitigation risk reduction methods.
Good. Thanks, Stella. And I think those might be medium to longer term interventions, right? The incorporation of windows and doors. But as we saw, a lot of the shelters that are actually on the ground, You can't put windows or doors. But what we can do practically is make sure that women-headed households are separated from male-headed households in terms of security. We can do that because site planning is very much one of the jobs or roles or responsibilities of the shelter cluster. And we've done it in lots of other contexts. We have separated female-headed households. That can happen. But we also need to start thinking, I don't want to say start thinking, we need to do tomorrow is talk about community-based protection mechanisms. Community-based policing might be too strong of a word, but community-based protection networks. And we have them in many, many contexts across the globe, where, as you mentioned, community members, and they could be women, are responsible for ensuring that environments are safe. And we have had success with that. And I'm going to put that as another recommendation that the protection cluster, the shelter cluster, and the GBV AOR can work together to try and bring about. And this also speaks to urban, right? The issue about safety and protection in urban settings as well. Victoria, community safety plans are great as well. And I like that we're also talking about coordination is key. And this will be my last point before I hand it over to Akiko to end our session today. Coordination is key when we are talking about shelter. We need to make sure that we are assessing risks, but then moving beyond identifying the needs, but then also doing practical, small practical interventions that will reduce our risks to gender-based violence. You can do that. I know you can. Everything we have mentioned today is practical, right? I know, of course, some of them will take money, but let's focus on those that don't cost us any money. And we've mentioned those. Take those with you. I know Akiko has written them down and will share them with you. This recording will be uploaded to our GBV AOR YouTube channel. So if you or a colleague would like to listen to this for the first time or again, you can find it there. I want to hand it over to Akiko to close us out for today. And I want to thank you very much for joining us. And I look forward to hearing all of the great interventions that you will start doing tomorrow to mitigate the risks of gender-based violence for survivors and those at risks of GBV. Over to you, Akiko.
Okay, thank you, Jessica, again for this amazing session, and thank you all for the participation. I don't know if Eva is here, but I really appreciate this collaboration. I've been to a field visit, so many times, and this has been my concern for a long time. And also, we, our GBV working group coordinators, we are active in 12 states, have shared a lot of concerns about shelter. So, but today we identified a lot of, action points that we can work together. So I'm going to put them down together and also send, to all of you, as well as shelter cluster members, with the recording and also the list of resources we mentioned during the call. So this is just the beginning of, our efforts for, addressing GBV risks in shelter programming. So, we hope there will be another opportunity to meet again, hopefully next time in person. We usually do in-person training, but this year we couldn't do it. And, so, we look forward to further collaboration and stay in touch. And I'm just going to put my email in the chat box. Let me just stop sharing. put my email in the chat box so that you can reach out to us, as well as the focal point for the state level GBV working group coordinators. So they are all, trained on GBV risk mitigation. So if there is any specific issue that you want to discuss bilaterally at the states that you're working, please contact them. Please allow me to just access file. So our GBV subsector email address is here. I'm just going to put it in the chat box. Okay. And I'm also going to send the email. First chat. Yes, here it is. Yeah. And this will, be delivered to me and also my subnational coordinator who is supporting state level coordination from national level, Nuha, and other, colleagues who are working for GBV subsector. So that's the email address. And then this is a list of the coordinators. We have representatives and coordinators and focal points in 13 states now. We are trying to expand it to 16 states very soon. So if you can't find your states, we have partners working in some states that we have not yet established GBV working group. So please reach out to me. I'm happy to introduce you to the local GBV partners so that you can work together with them. There are local women-led organizations as well, so that they will give you a great advice and reflecting women and girls' voices in shelter programming as well. Okay. Yes, thank you so much. Shelter and Network Cluster Sudan will support more initiative in the future. Yes, great way to end the session with a very strong commitment from all of you. And thank you again, everyone. And thank you again to Jessica and also Siva.
Okay, thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon, and be safe wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.